Alright, what's up guys? This is the Carbon TruFoam Genesis, and I have been using it for the last 2 months. After being teased on and off with launch dates constantly changing, it's finally here and available for purchase. The question I'm going to pose though is, can it possibly live up to the hype? I mean, think about it. In all of 2024, we saw companies pushing the boundaries of what was legal in regards to speed and spin, which has now set expectations in people's minds of what a paddle can be. But now that the new regulations are finally setting in place, and with how long people have waited for this paddle, I just question if it can truly live up to the hype that people have created in their own minds. But I'll present you guys with the information and let you decide. As always, a quick disclosure before we dive into the rest of the video. Carbon did send these paddles to me for free, but they did not pay for this review, they didn't have any input on what to say, and all thoughts are my own. I do have an affiliate link down in the description that helps support the channel when you use it, but it doesn't come at any expense to you and helps us to keep creating reviews just like this. Before we dive into the specs of the paddle, I want to quickly go over the name of this paddle. Prior to release, everyone kept calling it the TruFoam, but technically this model is called the Genesis, and the core technology that they're using is called TruFoam. So the full name would be the TruFoam Genesis Carbon 2, or even just Carbon 2 Genesis. Since they will continue to use this technology for future paddles, calling it just TruFoam wouldn't identify the model that you're actually using, because future versions will also have TruFoam in the name. I'm only bringing this up now because I could easily see this getting out of hand and people referring to it in the wrong way, and this getting really confusing when future models come out. It's similar to how people sometimes say Selkirk Invicta, where Invicta is just the shape, but doesn't tell you anything about the model that you're holding. So if you hear someone say, oh, I use a Selkirk Invicta, you're like, okay, well, which Invicta is that? But anyways, with that out of the way, here are the full specs of the paddles. The price is $279.99, but you can use discount code PBStudio to shave 10% off, which brings the price down to $262. There are going to be 3 shapes available at launch, which mostly mimic the shapes that Carbon has previously used. I'll put up a bunch of the specs on screen now for you to see, but here are the gist of the 3 shapes. They have the 1, 2, and 3 shapes. The 1 is an elongated paddle with a 5.5-inch handle. The 2 is a new updated shape with a longer 5.25-inch handle. And the 3 is an elongated paddle with a shorter 5.25-inch handle like the Selkirk Invicta shape. One thing I did find slightly odd is that Carbon didn't max out the dimensions on the 1 and 2 shapes. The width of the 1 is 7.35 inches instead of 7.5 inches. However, that is how the old Carbon 1X shape has always been, so if you're used to it, it won't be anything new to you. The 2 is 7.85 inches instead of 8 inches. While it's a very small difference, it would have been nice to see the full amount utilized, and in my opinion, doesn't really make sense to make it slightly narrower. Now, some of the more important stats you may be looking for are twist weight, swing weight, and RPM, which I will also put on the screen for all 3 models now. One thing you'll notice is that all 3 units get exceptionally good spin. There have been very few paddles that I have managed to get past 2100 RPM, so it was awesome to see all of these exceed 2100 RPM. Now, just as a note, my original Carbon 3 unit from November had a swing weight of 125, but apparently Carbon has since made adjustments to the 3 shape and tried to lower the average swing weight to 118 or 120. I don't have one of these new units myself, so I have to take Carbon's word for it, but they told me they were trying to lower it. The Carbon 1 is slightly lower in swing weight than your average elongated paddle, coming in around 117 to 120. My unit was 117. However, the Carbon 2 is slightly higher than your average wide body paddle, coming in at 112 to 114. My unit was 112, and this never caused any issues in my play, but if you are looking for a wide body paddle with a very low swing weight, similar to something like a PaddleTech ALWC, this isn't quite there and is going to feel heavier. The twist weights are as follows. The 1 was 5.64, the 2 was 6.68, and the 3 was 6.38. These are all lower than what you would usually expect in my opinion, except for maybe the 3. However, I don't feel that the paddle's sweet spot played the way that the twist weight would suggest, and part of that may be due to an entirely new design that we haven't seen yet. So maybe these numbers won't correlate as much like they do with polypropylene cores. We've seen this once before with the Rhombus Ripple, which had pretty low twist weights, but the sweet spot actually felt very good. So maybe with some of these foam core paddles, we will see some of these lower twist weights not mean as much as they did on other types of cores. One final note for the specs is that these do have a patch of fiberglass in them in the center of the sweet spot, which you can see in this X-ray, which should help give the paddle a bit more pop, but it is only in the center block where the cutout of the circular holes are, so you're only going to be taking advantage of that if you hit the center. This could also lead to some people feeling inconsistent with the paddle depending on where they actually hit the ball. If you miss center a lot, catching the sweet spot might send the ball flying more than you were expecting because of the poppier fiberglass layer. Before we dive into the playability of this paddle, I want to go over how this paddle came to be because I think the design and construction of the paddle is the largest selling point of the TruFoam Genesis. Carbon is marketing this as the first 100% full foam core paddle. However, that's probably a slight stretch because gearbox paddles are largely made of foam. Yes, they do have carbon fiber ribs inside of them, but most of that structure is made of foam. So you can take that as you will, but I don't know if it's really the first full foam core on the market. The Genesis has been in development for the last 18 months, and I've had the pleasure of getting to see a lot of the prototypes that led to what it is today. These weren't your typical paddle formula where China came up with a concept and then pitched it to Carbon to create for them. They have an in-house engineer that I've been friends with for about 2 years now, and I've gotten to see a lot of this come together in that time. While the engineering, testing, and prototyping were all done in the US with their engineer, once they had the formula locked in, they did take it overseas to create for the masses, presumably because the cost would be too high in the US. They've also filed a patent on the design as well, which is patent pending currently. But anyways, this is what the TruFoam Genesis core looks like. It's a solid block of foam with this very interesting pattern cut out to create the play characteristics that it has. One thing you'll notice is that when trying to compress this foam with my hand, it doesn't compress at all. It actually feels very stiff, and no matter how hard I push, I can't make it compress, when compared to other foams which have traditionally been in pickleball paddles and they've been very squishy. So the rigidity of this core feels very high. Talking to the engineer, he says that they're able to tweak how the paddle plays based on the cutout design of the core as well as the density of the foam. So the options for what they can create from a playability standpoint are almost endless with this core. And I think that's going to give them an incredible platform to develop from. What is really cool is that because of how these are designed, if the regulations change, the paddles can be tweaked to be compliant very quickly with a new core design. These new models only come in a 14mm, but with how they develop the core, the thickness doesn't matter like it does with polypropylene. By changing the pattern of the core as well as the foam density, they can fully customize how the paddle plays without thickness being the main driver that creates a powerful or poppy paddle. So even though this paddle is a 14mm, I would just remove that concept from your head because in a lot of ways, the paddle feels like it plays closer to a 16mm than it does a 14mm. Finally, this paddle does pass the future 0.43 PB core standard for USAP. Carbon has opted not to disclose the exact PB core number, but they did say it is less than 0.43, which should mean it is safe from any delistings unless USAP decides to change the rules that are currently listed. Now let's talk about what I think is the single biggest reason that the TruFoam Genesis may be very popular, and that's the alleged durability of the core. Over the last 2 years, we have seen so many issues with thermoform paddles that utilize a polypropylene core. Core crushing has been a rampant issue in the industry and has led to paddles getting hotter and hotter when they shouldn't be. Since this paddle is fully foam, there is no polypropylene, so you won't be able to crush a TruFoam paddle. At least not in the way that you would like polypropylene cores. Carbon is also claiming that there will be no break-in and the paddle will play very consistent even over a long period of time. I've played my Genesis for 2 months now, and we even have backups of all the shapes so that we could compare one that is well used to one that isn't used at all. And over that time, we've not observed any changes to the paddles. Isaac played with the Carbon 1 and I played with the Carbon 2. Comparing our brand new units, there was nothing that seemed different to us. Now, am I going to go out and say that this paddle will have zero issues and it's impossible to change? Absolutely not. While the core has performed exceptionally well in terms of durability for me, we will have to wait and see how it holds up in the mass market once everyone gets theirs. Small samples out in the wild are not the same as mass production, and the paddles experiencing loads of different environments and play styles may find other issues that weren't identified early on. Now, it seems unlikely since they've been working on this for 18 months, and I've seen the durability of paddles that were even made about a year ago, but it's hard to know until these are just out everywhere and then we can see what the market experiences. If everything checks out and is as durable as Carbon claims, that'll be a huge win for the industry, and that's something that may make the price worthwhile to some people. The day that I don't have to mention core crushing in a review anymore is going to be an amazing day. If you are on the fence about the design lasting, I would recommend waiting a month or two, and then we'll probably have a pretty clear picture of how the paddles are holding up in the wild. I would always warn a consumer to be cautious going into the first generation of any new technology. You just don't know if anything in the first batch may not be built to spec at the factory properly, and we've seen that happen a few times in pickleball. I don't know that that's going to happen for the Carbon, but if you are worried about that, then I would hold off for now. All right, during our testing, we primarily used the Carbon 1 and Carbon 2 shapes. I did try the 3, however, I really didn't enjoy it. To me, it just felt clunky, and since our unit had a high swing weight of 125, I just didn't find it enjoyable to use. Now that I'm hearing that the new 3 models will have a lower swing weight, that may make them better to use, but even then, the 1 and 2 are more in my preferred paddle shape anyways. The shape you choose is mostly going to be what you're used to and comfortable with. If you're used to the Selkirk Invictus shape, then the 3 is probably the one you want. However, I think that most people looking to buy a TruFoam Genesis are going to be better fitted with the 1 or 2. The 2 will give you a more generous sweet spot, and the 1 will give you the longer handle for a two-handed backhand. The 3 will be for people who like to choke up higher on their paddle and not have a long handle in their way. All right, now that we're talking about on-court performance, let's just get this out of the way now. If you're expecting this paddle to be a full-blown power paddle, this is not it. At least not in the stock form. This is a more aggressive all-court paddle, but even then, I find that slightly generous to say. However, now that paddles like the Mod and Gearbox are being delisted in July, that does probably shift this paddle slightly closer to the power spectrum than it would have been prior to those being delisted. For the first portion of this segment, I will be talking about how the paddle plays stock and then how it played after my modifications, which did make a noticeable difference, and I would stick around to find out what those differences were. As someone who doesn't generate a ton of power, I never found that my putaways or drives were enhanced by using the Genesis. For more compact strokes, the paddle wasn't as jumpy as, say, a Spartus Olympus, Ronbus Ripple, Yola 3S, or the Paddletech Bantams. So if you really enjoy the feeling of a paddle having a lack of dwell time and just popping off the face really aggressively, the TruFoam Genesis likely won't fit that role for you. But if you do enjoy the ball feeling like it sits on the face longer or has the sensation that the face is pocketing the ball, then I think the TruFoam Genesis is going to fit very well. Since foam has historically been a material that causes drastic amounts of powers in paddles, I wanted to give you a clear picture of what to expect when you try it yourself. It's not a slouch, but it also isn't over the top by any means, which is what Carbon was aiming for given the controversy around all the power paddles recently. One of the areas that I think will stand out immediately when trying the Genesis for the first time is the ball feel. The feel on the TruFoam Genesis isn't as tingy as a polypropylene core, but it also isn't as springy or soft feeling as EVA foam. It's kind of like a mix between the two. It's one of those paddles that you're just gonna have to hit it yourself to get a really good grasp of how it feels, but if you kind of imagine something between the two, that's roughly where I think it lands. So I think the feel is going to be the first thing that everyone will immediately notice and probably determine whether you dislike the paddle or not. Since this paddle falls into the all-court category or all-court leaning power, which is my preferred style of paddle, I felt like this was very easy to use. There was no adjustment period for me or nothing that I had to adjust in my stroke mechanics to be able to use the paddle. I was able to just pick it up and start playing with it right away. To be honest, there's not much I can find fault with in the paddle. Usually there are certain areas that I can immediately find in a paddle that are jarring, unpleasant, or make it hard for certain types of shots, but I never really had any of those issues. The soft game felt very easy. It might not be levels of easy like a Volair Mach 2 Forza, but I never found myself excessively popping up dinks or having issues resetting in the midcourt. In regards to the soft game, it felt like a very reliable paddle that you knew what you were going to get from it. It doesn't have that non-linear power curve like some power paddles do, where the less you give in your swing, the softer it acts, and then when you go for a large swing, the acceleration of the ball is exponentially faster. Because of this, I found the paddle to be pretty predictable and easy to use. One area that the Genesis specifically excels in is spin. While the peel ply texture of this face does not feel that rough, the paddle is able to add a crazy amount of shape to the ball if you have the swing mechanics to take advantage of it. This is likely due to the TruFoam core, and this is another feature that I think will make this paddle stand out a lot. There are going to be some players that are able to generate some very excessive topspin with this paddle, and I think for singles, especially on passing shots, it's going to be a lot of fun. My biggest question is how much of that spin will it retain after months of use? While grit isn't the end-all be-all for spin on a paddle, I do find that even these paddles that utilize the core to largely generate their spin, that face texture still plays a very important role. So the jury is still out on whether spin is going to hold up very well on the Genesis over time. I suspect that it will be like most paddles, and once the grit is very worn, you're going to want a fresh amount of grit if spin is something you heavily rely on. Now that Carbon has made some advancements with their core technology lasting longer, I would love to see in the future face textures that last even longer. While there are things on the market like Reload, which allow you to replace the texture on demand, which is pretty awesome, it's only available for their one paddle, which doesn't really help the rest of the industry and the grip problems that we continue to face. In regards to the sweet spot, I'm going to put it right around average. I don't think it has quite the sweet spot size that thermoform paddles have, but it's not lacking exceptionally like a Gen 1 paddle. Prior to putting weight, there were a few areas of the face that were returning less energy than I would have preferred, and that could have also been from missing the fiberglass patch, but after adding weight, that largely went away, and the paddle's sweet spot is still quite a bit better than a Paddletech Bantam, in my opinion. So yeah, I would just summarize the sweet spot as average. It's not oversized, but it's probably not going to be a big problem for most of you either. Now I want to go over how I set up our paddles, because I think this made a pretty big difference in the playability. The first thing I did was remove the stock grip and added 2 overgrips. I liked how the handle shape felt this way better than with the stock grip and then putting an overgrip on top of it. It slimmed the handle down just enough and felt better in my hand overall. I ended up trying 3 different weight setups on my Carbon 2. Setup 1 was 5 inches at 3 and 9. Setup 2 was 3-gram strips on all 4 corners. And then the one that I settled on was a longer 7 to 8 inch strip at 3 and 9 that went down through the bottom corners. Setup 3 gave me the most amount of extra juice from the paddle, which, I mean, that makes sense. It's the most amount of weight out of all of those setups. But the other setups, I kind of felt like, okay, yeah, this is making a difference, but it's not that drastic. This one specifically took that paddle from all court, maybe being on the aggressive side, to this is definitely on the aggressive side and starting to hang with some of those power paddles that are out right now. There was a noticeable jump on drives and even counters at the kitchen. It also helped increase the twist weight to make the paddle feel a bit more stable and provide some more energy on those off-center shots. Everyone's going to be different in the setup that they prefer, but this is what I found really made the Carbon 2 shine. With this setup, the swing weight went from 112 to 119, and the twist weight from 6.68 to 8.08. The stock weight also went from 8.1 ounces to 8.64. The weight that I was using was the Pickleball Effect tungsten tape, which is the 0.5 gram per inch, so it is a little bit lighter per inch of gram. I personally prefer using this because I can cover a larger portion of the paddle and not have the weight so heavily concentrated in just one spot. While 119 isn't my preferred swing weight number, it never really bothered me on the Carbon 2. I really liked how this weight setup made the paddle play, so the trade-off in maneuverability felt worth it. Now, another thing that I noticed is that the Carbon 2 responded better, or at least differently, to weight than the Carbon 1. Isaac had a weight setup with 6 grams on the bottom corners, which played pretty nice, but after the setup I tried on the Carbon 2 and how big of a difference it made, I tried that same setup on the Carbon 1, and while it certainly hit a little bit harder, it didn't seem to have the same impact that it did on the Carbon 2. After I realized this, I spoke to the engineer and asked him why that might be. He said the way the Genesis core layout is designed, it's actually easier to achieve power at lower forces on the Carbon 2, whereas the 1 and 3, it may take more head speed of your paddle in order to get the same power out of it. This would make sense for someone like myself because I probably don't have the head acceleration on my swing to get that power out of the 1 shape. So that might be something you want to consider depending on the type of player you are and the shapes that you usually prefer. I did really enjoy playing with the 1, and I think in their stock form, the Carbon 1 does hit harder, but after this weight setup, I did end up definitively preferring the Carbon 2. After the final weight setup, I compared it against paddles like the Engage Pursuit 1, Spartus Olympus, and Paddletech TKOC 14.3mm, and I found that the pop and power of the Carbon 2 was much more in line with those than it was stock. So I feel pretty confident that after this weight setup, it's definitely entering into the power realm territory. Okay. So that was a lot of information. Let's go ahead and summarize this review. The TruFoam Genesis introduces a core that we have never seen before with durability claims that go unmatched by the rest of the industry. If those claims hold up, this will be a huge win for Carbon. I've thoroughly enjoyed using the TruFoam, and it's a paddle I would consider using as my main. But I will say, I think this is one of the first expensive paddles that while I really enjoy it, if I had to go out and spend my own money, I'd have to actually really think about whether it was worth it for me or not. I just keep going back to how you expect a wow factor at this price. And I think for some players, that's going to be missing. Unless some of those things you really want are very good spin, a potentially very durable core, and a unique feel off the face that really pockets the ball. But I don't think it has that same wow factor that many people experienced the first time they tried a mod or a Gearbox Pro Power. But for some of you who are coming from those paddles, the TruFoam Genesis may seem a lot less exciting because it's just not going to hit as hard as those. I think Carbon is laying the foundation for what could be some amazing technology for them moving forward, but you will definitely be paying a premium to get access to it right now. So, who would I recommend this paddle for? I think it's for people who are not concerned with a budget. If price tag is a big consideration for you, I would probably say that you should pass on this. 2, people who are looking for an all-court or slightly aggressive all-court paddle. Once paddles like the Mod and Gearbox are gone, this probably is going to feel a bit more powerful. But if you do add a good amount of weight, like I did on my 2, that does also put it in the power realm. 3, people who are sick of core-crushed polypropylene cores. However, keep in mind that if this is a big reason for you to buy, you may want to wait a month or 2 to be positive that this release shakes out the way Carbon is claiming. I would remain skeptical until we've seen some more proof. 4, I think this is for someone who really likes to shape the ball and has an aggressive semi-western grip for their forehand. If you're a former tennis player that can impart a lot of spin, then I think you're going to have a lot of fun with this paddle. So with that being said, I would recommend that most of you try demoing one of these before you purchase. I think there will be a lot of people who will be obsessed with the TruFoam Genesis and love how it performs, and I honestly think it's a top performer in the market. But it isn't a power paddle, and for $280, it will be a very tough price to swallow, and not everyone's going to find it worth it to spend that much, especially when you have exceptionally good paddles coming out at cheaper prices from companies like 11624. So anyways, those are my thoughts on the paddle. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.